listeners. Welcome to Idio Talk, or should I say Video Talk. The Video Talk episodes are where Zach and I discuss movies. We do one of these every once in a while. It's always a movie that we have some sort of shared obsession with, often from childhood. This time, definitely from childhood. We are talking about 1994's Clifford, a cult classic starring Martin Short and Charles Grodin that I know Zach and I have both seen many, many times. It had been a while.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about kind of what our connection to this movie is and why we're talking about it. But before that, just because less people, you know how like it's like something that is a point of reference for you, you sometimes have blinders on about and you think, yeah, everybody knows Clifford. I don't think that is so with this movie. I've gotten a lot of blank stares when I've asked people if they've seen Clifford. And if they have an association with it, it is usually The Big Red Dog, not a movie where Martin Short plays a 10-year-old boy, which is pretty much what this movie is.
Yeah, exactly.
This movie is...
And so much more.
And so much more, and also maybe also not, but we'll get into it. This movie is about Martin Short playing the titular character, Clifford. It's a 10-year-old boy obsessed with dinosaurs and a theme park called Dinosaur World. Because of a series of events caused by Clifford, he ends up having to stay with his uncle, played by Charles Grodin, his Uncle Martin, and in Los Angeles, where Clifford does not live. He is supposed to be taken to Dinosaur World by his uncle. And when that does not happen, Clifford wreaks havoc upon his Uncle Martin's life. I would say this is a very odd movie. It is a PG, like ostensibly a family film. It's rated PG, and it's kind of like packaging and marketing wise, it's definitely being pushed that way. But this is a deeply strange and dark movie. And yeah, what do you think? I'm even leaving anything out for folks who may be hearing about
the
Clifford
only thing
for the
I would
first
add,
time?
The only thing I would add is the sort of the mechanism of the way the story unfolds, because like you just recapped it super simply, because it is a relatively simple story on its face, right? As a lot of movies can be. But what they do, and what I think is really effective, and I hadn't thought of this before, is the movie is bookended by Clifford as an old man in the year 2050. He's an elderly priest named Father Clifford. And the reason that we are told this story is because Father Clifford catches a young boy. It's like a school for boys. I think Troubled Youths is sort of the setup, running away from that school because that little boy blew up the gymnasium of the school because he was mad he couldn't play sports. So yeah, the way it unfolds is when I was a boy, and then we get this window into Clifford's adventures, wreaking havoc upon his Uncle Martin's life, like you said.
Now, I first saw this movie when I was a little kid. I would say older than the 10-year-old and speaking of which, we're going to have a guest on a little later to discuss how this movie holds up to the modern 10-year-old. We're going to have a 10-year-old named Oliver Glenn on a little later, who watched this movie with me a few days ago to see what he thought of it. So that'll be hopefully some interesting insight into the character. Yeah. I think I was older than 10 when I saw this movie. If I had to guess, I would say I was 11 or 12. My memory of seeing this movie is on cable at Marmar and Papa's Victorian house with, I believe, former guest of the show, Aaron Ross.
Wow.
And probably a few of his siblings. But I just remember this being a thing where, like none of in our family, like not only did Zach and I not have TV for not all of our childhood, but different stretches of our childhood. And when we did, it was, this was back when you had 3 channels and our grandparents had cable, which was a big deal back then. And a lot of our cousins did not have televisions. And so when we
in
would
their
go
homes, they didn't have because we always had a television to watch movies on. But yes, some of our family did not even, their families didn't even own a television, which was pretty unique.
Yes. And so all that to say, when a mix of grandkids would be at our grandparents'. There's a 99% chance we were all immediately plopping in front of the TV to watch, things like the Disney Channel. And that is my memory of seeing Clifford, is it coming on. And I want to say it probably we started watching it towards really early in the film. I don't know if I saw the opening with him as an old man. The first thing I remember is the airplane stuff. So maybe about like 5 minutes into the movie. And Aaron, I have a memory of our cousin Aaron being like, oh, this is Clifford. This movie's really funny. Nice, and it's all just being like great and like watching it and loving it. And I've seen it many times since throughout the years. I've always held a really special place in my heart for this movie. I've always known that it is not a popular movie, but I have also been surprised when I've shown this movie to people and had it not hit, because I watched it around a group of, I just remember this being a really common reference point, this movie, among not just you and I, but like with a bunch of our cousins as well. And so I've just always grown up kind of assuming everybody thinks Clifford is hilarious, which is decidedly not so. So I've seen it a lot, but this was the first time I've watched it in, probably like 15 years, if I had to guess. What's your first memory and kind of current relationship to this movie?
I honestly can't place it in a first memory. As you were describing what you were describing, like a implanted memory was starting to generate, but I cannot say with any level of certainty that I was there for that. I feel like, the corners of your brain.
I bet you were, though, honestly.
Yeah.
Dude. Like, how much time did we spend separated, when we were little kids?
But, it is, like you said, it was definitely a common reference point between you and I growing up and up to present day. It's funny that we did all this explanation, but I could think of at least 2 times in our previous season when we covered the band Radiohead when you quoted this movie. In our Batman episode, we were talking, so not about Radiohead, in our 1989 Batman episode of Idio Bat, as we called it. We're talking about whether Kim Basinger has curly hair or straight hair or wavy hair. And you said, Vicky has wavy hair. I believe there's a difference, which is a line in this movie that we may or may not cover in depth. But
I believe there is a difference is huge for me. I say that in that tone.
Yes.
A lot. Yeah.
But
I believe there is a difference. The musicality of how he says it.
There's a lot. I think there are several of those lines, but that would be one of the strongest. And at any rate, though, I don't remember when I saw it, but it was at that very, very impressionable point, as you are for all movies, but like Dumb and Dumber, for instance, right?
Yeah.
We got for the Christmas, for 1995's Christmas, I think we as brothers were gifted Dumb and Dumber and Batman Forever. And those were movies that were just on steady rotation. And Dumb and Dumber definitely, like with, guys that I met later in life, like Big Gulps, huh? Or whatever is a common reference point that people get. And I feel like between you and I, it's like we wanted it to have that same cultural resonance as Dumb and Dumber does. You know? Like you can say Big Gulps, huh, to somebody that you barely know, but kind of know their sense of humor, and 50% chance you'll get a laugh pending their age. But Clifford, it is so quotable. The performances from everyone, I think, are so strong.
Really committed.
How strong the movie is, we'll get into all that. And I know we have a guest, like you mentioned, but as far as my relationship to it now, it's like a lot of things I grew up, a lot of great art or movies that I grew up on. I'm able to look at them and not say like, oh, this should have been different or that sucks or whatever. But I do think, like the character played by Charles Grodin, there was a lot more for me to relate to this go around, not having any children of my own, being an uncle, and I'll kind of, I'm leading into a lot more things, so I'll kind of stop there. I really enjoyed this rewatch, though. I'll tell you that much, Walker.
I did too. I mean, I laughed a lot. It holds up for me, which is great. I mean, it still makes me laugh. I do think it is a movie that I am too close to see truly objectively.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Like, I believe you used the word imprint. And I think that it kind of impacted my sense of humor so intensely so early that I don't think that it cannot be funny to me. Sure, go
ahead. I just want to interrupt you real quick. As Kailani and I, former guest, my wife Kailani and I were sitting down to watch it in the plane, which is, listeners, the second scene of the movie, 10 minutes in, she looks at me and she goes, I could see why you and Walker love this movie so much. He's very devious. Which we've talked about our antagonistic sense of humor and all that, but that made me laugh so hard. I was so excited to tell you that.
Well, I noticed a couple things in it this watch that I'm like, oh, I think I do this thing that he does where I put my face out towards someone to be kissed. Like if I'm in a relationship, I do the thing where it's like, instead of just saying, hey, give me a kiss, I do this thing where I like very expectantly, like, and you listeners, you have to see what he does, but he like closes his eyes and makes this incredibly off-putting face.
way. Yeah, Martin Short is so gifted with his expressions in both a revolting way, in one particular scene, in a way where I feel genuine heartbreak, like as if you like when you see a injured animal or a child that in need or something like that, and terrifying as well. So did I say revolting, heartbreaking, and terrifying? So quite a range in this 90 minutes.
Which is okay. I think that like we should talk about the fact that this movie is like a total commercial and critical bomb, and a critical bomb to a point that I was surprised by looking into it for this discussion.
Sure.
I knew that this movie didn't do well, but I was like like nobody in the critical community had anything nice to say about this movie, and nobody who reviewed this movie found it funny at all. And while I acknowledge that I am in some ways maybe unable to see this movie totally objectively, I can see problems with it. I think there are scenes that are not that funny. Like the scenes that are funny are truly hilarious to me, but there are like parts where I'm a little bit like, like there's not anything like terribly funny happening in this scene. Tonally, I can really see why this movie is like off-putting. Because Martin Short as this character is like deeply fucked up and weird. And like kind of unredeeming. But I cannot get in the mindset of watching this movie and not finding some of the interplay between Martin Short and Charles Grodin funny. There are scenes where the way they are interacting with each other is so insanely funny to me, and
brilliant.
I
would say brilliant.
Yeah, it's just too exactly like both of them are treating the material so seriously.
Yes,
and and it's I'm really astonished that people had nothing nice to say about this movie.
Well, I love that as an intro. So, listeners, hopefully those of you that have ridden along with us for, we've done an episode already this season, Video Talk for the King of Comedy. Listeners, you know that Walker and I like to talk background. In the case of this film, I think, though, what you were just saying of critical and commercial failure leads into the background, if you don't mind, real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're not going to go as heavy as we did on previous films, is all I meant to say. We don't need to go through the cast. We already talked about that. But my next bullet is Orion Pictures. So Orion Pictures has quite a bit of lore in Hollywood in terms of IP that they owned that then went into limbo because they went bankrupt and became a defunct company. So the production dates of this movie span 1990 to 1994. Right. And so the film was shot in 1990 and originally planned for release in the summer of 1991, but it remained in limbo for several years due to Orion Pictures' very bleak financial situation. So analysts and folks knew it was coming for a full year, like, oh, it's just a matter of when, essentially, is my understanding. And it wasn't released until 1994. And like you just said, it was a critical and commercial failure. I don't have this written down, but it made under $10 million. I think it made $9 million and had a budget around $13 million. And I'm going to get to what you were speaking to, even if it seems like I'm straying here. But the writer, or co-writer rather, Stephen Campman, had the idea of doing a comedy version of the 1956 film The Bad Seed. Now, Walker, have you ever seen The Bad Seed?
I have. Have you?
It's terrific.
It's really fun.
Rhoda. I mean,
I watched it with mom once.
Me too.
Like, oh, okay. I wonder.
So I love
the same
that
time
detail. So this was the spark, right? Steve Campman had that idea. The film,
which
was
The Bad Seed,
by...
for listeners who don't know, is a movie about a murderous little girl who behaves very perfectly on the outside and is a bad seed. She's pure evil.
Bad seed. So Orion liked that idea. They greenlit the film, but producers were concerned that because there was another evil child film coming out. No, not Chucky, not whatever sequel they're on by that point. The 1990 film Problem Child. So this would have been about 1989 when they greenlit it, and they put a halt to production. And then eventually, nearing their bankruptcy, they said, "Okay, let's get going on this one." And I loved this detail so much. The writer of the film, co-writer Stephen Campman, suggested the child lead be played by Martin Short, who was a fan of The Bad Seed. I don't know if they had a relationship or what that made him go to that, but Martin Short was very interested, and they did screen tests with Short as Clifford, and Orion said, "Great, let's do it." Steve Campman was hired as the director, but then the disagreements emerged between him and other members of the creative team, and Orion eventually brought in director Paul Flaherty to replace him.
And you know the connection between Martin Short and Paul Flaherty, right?
No, maybe. Tell me.
Well, do you know who Joe Flaherty is?
I know the name sounds very familiar.
Joe Flaherty is Martin Short's SCTV
yes,
fellow cast member who you and I know best from The Dad and Freaks and Geeks and the guy who calls Shooter a jackass in Happy Gilmore. So this is his brother
that way.
who I looked up and also wrote and acted on SCTV. It was more behind the scenes, but was a big part of the writing staff at SCTV. So there's a connection to Martin Short there. I don't know if these writers also have a connection to that like Canadian comedy world, but that
Canadian comedy world is so rich. My God, as much shit as we've given our northern neighbors for their music and everything else about them. I mean, Eugene Levy, Catherine O'Hara, Joe Flaherty. I mean, it's just such a huge geographical area, but not a high population in totality.
Well, and everyone you just named is all
Carrey.
from SCTV, but Jim Carrey, Seth Rogen,
Rogen, exactly. Almost done here. So, like I said, the film was shot in 1990. It was released. Orion goes bankrupt, and they're looking at this movie, and they said, okay, maybe they thought it was funny. So those bookended scenes of where Clifford is as Father Clifford, that I think really complete the narrative and give the story a nice beginning and end in this really dark kind of, the majority of the film, hour 20 minutes. Those were filmed 4 years later. And so he had to get back into character. And I think does a remarkable job. He's playing a much older version of the child version, but it's like, I was talking about this with Kai and a friend the other night. When producers or production companies will bring a show back, and just like that right now, Sex and the City or Arrested Development, even, it's not that the actors that's why they're professionals and why they make the big bucks to get back into character. But there's something about, and this is a film that's a little bit of not the best example, but there's something about when like 4 seasons of a show, you build into the character. And for Martin Short, all I'm trying to say that it's 10 minutes of screen time. Like I said, I don't think that you feel a 3-year disconnection. And I think it was very wise that they added these bookended scenes. And
so wait,
that's
so
all
I have a question though. So were the bookended scenes, were the Father Clifford scenes in the script, but they shut down production before they finished, or it was like, okay, we're gonna try to put this out now, but you need to put something like more uplifting?
They were in the script, but they had to flesh that out and shoot it so that they could release it. So okay, I don't have like the most grand, but just even still, I mean, it's like, he did 3 movies that were pretty successful in between then. And he's a professional. That's why they're actors. That's why they make the money. It's still impressive to me.
Yeah, sure.
And then, so like I said, we're not going to go super heavy on the background. It was a critical and commercial failure, but that was how I was going to tie it together, though, is that there was not a marketing push behind this film. You sent me through text an insane kind of what they would put on the VHS cover or poster that I want to let you talk about. But the one that I was always familiar with is it shows Charles Grodin and Mary Steenburgen standing next to one another. And the tagline says, "What is the difference between a pit bull between a pit bull and Clifford?" And it says one will tear your heart out, stomp on it, this and that. The other is a dog. And it showed Clifford holding a dog chain. I think I had the tagline backwards, but it's not indicative of a funny movie. And it's just really brightly colored. It's just a movie you'd walk by in the video store and never think twice about. And then I don't know if you want to talk about the insane one you sent me, Walker.
Well, they sent Zach this poster, the theatrical poster where Charles Grodin and Martin Short's heads are very poorly. I guess maybe it would be
they look mutinous
shot back then, but their heads are too small on the bodies that they've been put on. I don't know why they didn't have. I don't know. I guess maybe because of the limbo this movie is in, maybe they didn't do any like photo shoots or something, but their heads are pasted onto these bodies in a really bizarre way. The tagline is better. It's Uncle Martin is suffering from a little problem. And then ... Clifford, a comedy with a lot of laughs and a 10-year-old terror. But I can still see why when you saw this poster, I wouldn't know from looking at this poster that Martin Short is supposed to be a 10-year-old boy. I think
not at all.
I think you need to see him because in this other one, in this other cover, he's between Mary Steenburgen and Charles Grodin, and and there's a house burning behind him, not a house that we'll ever see in the movie. And actually, that never happens in the movie, but you could see that he's shorter than them at least.
Well, and just to kind of like complete what you were saying about like how critically, I saw a review from Roger Ebert that was just like, this sucks, this is why it's bad. Intelligent dude. I don't always agree with his takes, but I think though, because this movie had no marketing push, we just talked about how weird the covers are. It was a box office flop. The reviews, they get to see it before the box office numbers. But I just think that there was a lot of environmental factors that made for this movie not being well received in its time. I do think that, I got to come with a thesis, Walker. I don't know if I need to give it now or later, if it matters, but I do think though that what's really, really interesting about this movie as a comedy, and I could see why it wouldn't grab somebody that's watching movies in a critical way like a Ebert or whomever, everyone seemed to hate it. It is funny. I don't laugh out loud consistently. It's his expressions. It's the catchphrases. It's in the intro of the film, and I don't want to let you jump in here, like if we want to highlight specific scenes, but like the exhaustion of his parents, of this demon child, that are kind of funny to kind of let resonate in your consciousness. And I love it. It is ridiculous and irreverent, but you know what other movie was panned? Happy Gilmore. I rewatched that last week. I've been on a 90s comedy run, and I have not laughed that hard, and I've seen Happy Gilmore over 20 times, but it'd been a long time. I've not laughed that hard in years at a movie. And I just love the irreverent, fantastical nature of 1990s comedy. And I'm not pining for a day, great movies are out now. I don't think comedies are, I think that was a golden era for irreverent comedy. I'll stop there.
Oh, I think so. I think so. No, I agree with that. I mean, look, I think lots of comedies are panned. There are comedies and horror movies are, I mean, and horror is in a very different place now. Now it's in this, very elevated kind of mode. Yeah. But genre movies get shitty reviews all the time, and it bugs me because it feels like they're not being judged on their merits, on the merits of what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to be, right? It's like, I don't think you should review Happy Gilmore or like John Carpenter's Halloween on like the same way you review Citizen Kane. Like it's a genre film, and you should be able to appreciate what it's doing within that genre if you're going to review it. but I feel like a lot of critics don't particularly like comedies or horror movies.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't surprise me that Happy Gilmore was panned, but it doesn't have a 13% on Rotten Tomatoes,
Mm-hmm.
and it made Adam Sandler a much bigger star. This movie came out, was forgotten, and everyone who remembered it except for you and me hated it. And then it turns out a lot of other people really love it. Like I said, Martin Short has said that he's like, if I see like a 35-year-old kind of stoner dude approaching me, I know he's going to talk to me about Clifford. Is like something,
or Frank, probably.
And
right?
he, by the way, is super proud of the movie. Like,
so was Charles Grodin. Charles Grodin defended it on Letterman.
So we both have just rewatched it. Is Clifford good, and why?
Oh, I think it's incredible, Walker. I think that, and comparing it to something like Happy Gilmore, I think Happy Gilmore is one of the tamer Adam Sandler movies. There's not a lot of homophobia or body shaming. And you know, Adam Sandler seems like a good guy, but his movies are often irreverent and very low level and do not age well in certain ways.
Yeah.
There is one scene in this movie that we could talk about later that I even think is dated and could be offensive, that I still think has a lot of humor to it based solely on Charles Grodin's facial expression. But I would say it's pretty light on things that are like, you know, this just, you know what I'm speaking to, right? You know, like
the drag queen joke.
Yes. There's usually.
I also think that even though it is depicted as bad behavior, I also think the boss trying to assault Mary Steenburgen being played for laughs is like something you would not do now. And
not at all.
And I think that's good.
Yes, I agree. But like, even that scene though, well, we're getting ahead, but because you asked just a simple question. Yes, I think that it's a weird movie. I think that it's not nonstop laugh out loud like Dumb and Dumber still makes me do to this day. That could be nostalgia. Who knows? But I think Charles Grodin Charles Grodin's like, I've seen a few movies that he's in, he recently just passed away, but rest in peace. I think he is the most incredible straight man I've seen in a long time in this film, because like you talked about, Martin Short is playing a 10-year-old boy, and you're meant to buy that more or less for comedic effect. And the way Uncle Martin, played by Charles Grodin, interacts with him so seriously is incredible and brings a lot of laughs. What do you think?
I think it's good too. I mean, I think there's, like I said, I think there's a couple things that don't hold up, but none that are so egregious that it's like, oh, I'm completely taken out of the movie for me.
Sure.
And I think that when this movie is not working for me is when it kind of tries to be a normal 90s comedy.
I agree, for
example, like, like there's like some slapstick moments or whatever that are very just like, and had Beethoven already come out by the time they shot this?
No, I think Beethoven was 93.
Okay, so it's interesting.
But it is a scene with a dog, if that's what you're getting to.
There is a scene with a dog, and it's interesting because it does feel a little bit obligatory, like, because to me, growing up, Charles Grodin was the angry dad in Beethoven. That's all that I knew him as when I saw this movie later. There's a scene where, like, you know, he, like, a big dog drags him through the yard and he hits a fence that is like, you know, just, it feels like just an obligatory 90s comedy trying to appeal to kids with a big slapstick moment. Like, it feels like it's like, oh, okay, are we going to have to do like somebody gets kicked in the nuts type of a thing? I can't even think of a lot of other examples right now, because I don't think there's that many moments like that in the movie. Those are the ones where I'm like, this is boring and it's not doing anything in scenes like this enough to be interesting. But the rest of the time, like any time that he and Martin Short are interacting with each other, or it's moving or even the story, even the like kind of expositional stuff that's moving the story along, is all so weird and funny to me that I am like, I do think this movie was like not appreciated in its time.
No, totally.
And anything about it that doesn't really work now is because it's confined to being a 90s studio comedy. Like, I feel like if they had made it at a time where it's like they were able to just go any direction they wanted with it, it might have been a great movie instead of just a really good movie, which is, I think, what I would say it is.
Yes, but there are great moments, right? Which I think is, and so I think it's clear that we both. So I wrote these down in chronological order, but we don't have to go through it that way. But what I wanted to talk about, I know you will strongly relate to as a parent. Basically, if there's anything where I'm like, I could relate to that, I'm like, well, I know Walker will extra relate to it because he actually has a child. But we meet Clifford after we meet Father Clifford. He goes into his story. And his mom is clearly dealing with her demon child by drinking a lot of alcohol.
Yeah,
and
she's like super out of it.
Who plays his father? What's the name of that actor?
Richard Kind.
Walker, okay, the way he is Clifford hasn't technically done anything yet, but listeners, if you have a child or have a friend who, right as someone else's back is turned, they do the worst thing. He is treating Clifford like he can't predict Clifford's awful behavior, but he's so my God! Oh, look at that! Just like by the expression on his face.
He knows he's hyper vigilant because he knows, like you said, he can't control him, he can't predict it, but he knows he's doing horrible shit all the time. And the first thing in the movie that made me laugh out loud super hard was when Richard Kind sees him holding the Walkman, and he goes, "Where'd you get that? Where'd you get that? Oh my God! Is there no end to your madness?"
Walker, what I love that he does so much. So, listeners, in the plot of the movie, Clifford makes him do an emergency landing as they're flying to Honolulu. He makes him land in Los Angeles so that he could go to Dinosaur World, right? Like we talked about. There's that scene.
Which can I just interject real quick too? There's a running thing in the movie too, where when Clifford makes what I call his evil face, which is his eyes go half lidded, and he kind of, because Martin Short does these weird like vacant expressions throughout the movie, where it's almost like something is coming over him that is like from the outside, and he does this thing where he kind of, I keep trying to make the face, but it's an audio. So help me out if I'm not doing a good job.
Lowers his lids a little bit.
He lowers his eyelids. He kind of smiles, but it's like vacant and a little bit like slackens his
very
face.
serial killery.
And like looks off at some undefined point in the distance. And whenever he does this, it plays like Clifford's theme music, which is... Yeah. So the first time he does it is in the cockpit. He goes to meet the pilot and says, "Can we?" Like a little kid, like an innocent little kid goes, "Can you take this plane to LA so I can go to Dinosaur World?" And the pilot goes, "Well, the only way we could go to Los Angeles is if there was an emergency." And Clifford goes, "Whatever you say, my captain," and then does the evil face looking off into the distance. So that's like, the first time they show you that he's like truly malevolent.
Yeah, and it's like I'm sure a lot of our listeners have watched like those documentaries talking about like the psychopathy of people like Ted Bundy, and whether it's lore or not, there is typically a thing. I saw this look come over him and a vacancy came behind his eye, So, and it's like that, I feel like it was what Martin Short is embodying, which I think is really impressive. And it is funny. So anyway, so back in the airport though, like in the timeline of the movie, so Clifford's father does need to go on this business trip to Honolulu, and they're just exacerbated at the end of Clifford is barred from the plane from coming back on because he made them emergency land. So he calls Charles Grodin. You get the sense they have an icy relationship. It's never said why, which I love the omission.
Yeah.
And the scene, though, Walker, where he comes back to his wife and to Clifford, and it's like he's bonding with his tormentor because he's celebrating the fact that they don't have to take Clifford with Clifford. He goes, he bought it. He was almost excited. That made me laugh so hard.
And,
the relief at not having to have his child.
The parents are laughing maniacally because because they've foisted their evil child. It's like in It Follows, where have you seen It Follows? Yeah, it's like where you pass on the curse by having sex with it. They've like passed on the curse of Clifford to Martin, and they're laughing. And Clifford is just ecstatic because Uncle Martin lives in LA, so he's going to Dinosaur World. And also at the end of that scene cuts with Clifford playing his piccolo. Throughout the movie,
which he does throughout the film.
throughout the film, he periodically takes out and plays his own theme music that we hear whenever he's doing something evil on his piccolo, which and every time he plays, I don't know what Martin Short, he does this thing both with the evil face when he's wanting to be kissed and when he plays the piccolo, when he like rolls his eyes back into his head. It's so strange.
Yeah, and this is the last like scene I'll highlight for the sake of the plot, but like in the mechanics of the movie, Charles Grodin is in love with Miss Sarah Davis, played by Mary Steenburgen, and she's his fiance. She wants kids. He is older than her, and all of a sudden he needs to basically prove to her that not only like is he father material, but he's good with kids because she's a kindergarten teacher. And so like that is why the movie even interrupts itself to explain that. It's really funny. So that is why he's willing to like just have his nephew, who he's never met, not been around since his christening. He doesn't even remember his name.
Well, and Zach, this is the quote that Zach does the most, which he to stop her from basically walking out on him. A
nephew?
Yeah, she says, and he says, "I love my nephew," and she goes, "What's his name?" To which Charles Grodin says,
"I want to say Mason. Clifford, little Clifford." Anyways, so he's saddled with Clifford, and now Walker. I mean, I don't want to keep explaining this simple plot, but like you touched on it. But one of the things you said actually that stood out to me was like the slapstick moments are kind of where it's like, you know, kind of like, this feels like of its time. They maybe made him throw that in there. The scene you talked about, I agree. Also, when they're landing the plane, it shows the steward, flight attendant, you know, with the cart kind of feels a little wacky. There is a slapstick moment, though, that I love because things devolve super quickly between Clifford and Uncle Martin. He becomes a menace immediately, where the woman is swinging her purse to hit Charles Grodin and it hits Clifford in the face.
That part is funny. Yeah.
That part made me laugh. But I don't know. I want you to just take us through a little bit more.
Well, you said things devolve. So basically, it's like, yeah, all the details of the plot like don't really matter. But because of pressures at work, Uncle Martin has promised to take Clifford to Dinosaur World and then is not able to that day. Like originally, it's not even that he's not going to take him; it's that he can't take him that day, and because he can't take him that day, Clifford melts down and is like trying to like steer the moving car into traffic, tries to put himself in another family's car, and you know, like causes all these problems. And because of Clifford's behavior, Uncle Martin decides to punish him. He has no idea how to be like a parental figure, but his instinct
this is where I started to really relate to Charles Grodin's character because he's a good guy.
Right, but his instincts are wrong, and I feel like you can see his backstory of just like, well, what was my dad? My dad was a hard ass, so that's like what I mean, they don't reference this, but I could just see it in kind of the way of like just basing it on his age and the time he would have grown up.
But he's pretty gentle, though. I think based on his age and the time, though. I think he never tries to like discipline Clifford. No,
it's not even that. It's like that. It's just he doesn't know what else he's supposed to do. So it's just like, well, the one thing this fucking kid cares about is Dinosaur World. So I guess I'm probably not doing a good job if I still take him. Like, so, and then the movie after Uncle Martin, where the movie gets truly dark is it's after Uncle Martin is not taking him to Dinosaur World, that it then becomes an escalating war between the two characters where Clifford does something to Uncle Martin strikes back, and forth it goes. It becomes like kind of like a more absurd like Rushmore type of story. Yeah. Where
what's
it's
so
like
beautiful,
they're trying to, it's like only one of them can survive this feud, basically.
Well, I love the scene so much too that you were just talking about. So like after he breaks his promise because his boss saddles him with like a bunch of additional work to get done in 2 days, and he just can't take him that day. So they're back at home. And after Clifford was like trying to drive the car into pedestrians, you know, to go to Dinosaur World and, you know, does all kinds of stuff, they're back at home. And like you were saying, like an older school approach, But he wasn't planning on disciplining his nephew. He probably would have gave him a lot of rope. But he goes, bad boy, Clifford, bad boy. That is one of the moments where I was like, Charles Grodin is so impressive. He's looking at Martin Short, a fully grown man. And I don't know. And I that scene is hilarious. But then there's a scene that matches it later in the film. Go ahead.
Oh, my note about the bad boy was this is his first attempt at parenting.
Yes,
and you can tell that he's like trying it on, and he doesn't. And Clifford is even looking at him like trying to suss out what Uncle Martin's next move is going to be, because Clifford, I feel like, has a sense of like he's out of his depth with like trying to parent me here, because Clifford goes full in on trying to manipulate him too. And when Uncle Martin tells him you can't go, okay. So it's like the first really dark moment between Clifford or from Clifford at Uncle Martin is Uncle Martin tells him, you need to be punished for what you did, which means Dinosaur World is out. And Clifford stares like icily at him in his eyes with a weird frozen smile on his face. And he goes, but Uncle Martin, I would think a man as wise as yourself would know that breaking a little boy's promise and then punishing him for it would be a very terrible thing to do.
See, that sounds like a threat to me.
Well, he says, well, I imagine that little boy wouldn't be held responsible for what he did next.
Right.
Which is so crazy. But Zach, can we back up a little bit?
Of course.
Because I wanted to say, you said Uncle Martin is a good guy, and I don't think he's a bad guy, but I think he's kind of a cold guy.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a really funny moment early. So when Uncle Martin goes, he's going into his week with Clifford of like, he doesn't really know how to treat a kid, but he doesn't have any prejudice about Clifford being like shitty or anything like that. He's treating him like he's this very sweet and innocent kid. Right.
Yeah.
But I thought it was really funny because the first scene in where you sort of see cracks in their dynamic with each other is the bedtime scene.
Bedtime, yes.
Yeah. And Clifford has taken a ring, an engagement ring that Uncle Martin
he's eating donuts and drinking soda. I feel like Martin Short took his like SNL days and what he saw John Belushi doing with like literal cocaine and translated that to how a kid, because Clifford is like demon possessed essentially, and it's like his fuel. So like you see like just like a rock star like that, like doing lines, the way he drinks soda and eats sugar is like some. Anyways, go ahead. That's all.
Yeah, no, and you're right. And multiple scenes in the movie, it just cuts to him in the middle of like drinking like a 40-ounce soda or like but so he puts Clifford to bed, but. They get into a discussion about this engagement ring, and Clifford has found it and wants to keep it, and they're going back and forth about it, and Uncle Martin says, tells him
that's
that
very
he's
valuable.
Right, and he tells him he's planning on proposing to Sarah Davis with that ring, and Clifford goes, oh, that's so exciting. And then he goes, ring bearer, pointing at himself as in, I want to be the ring bearer at the wedding. And Uncle Martin just stares at him and goes, we'll see. And that was the first moment where I'm like, Uncle Martin is kind of starting to suspect, is this kid like fucking with me? And I don't think I like him. Is kind of that in that moment.
No, and it is the way I relate to that scene is like, you know, a lot of my friends like, you know, are at the point in their lives where they're having kids and, you know, whatever. I don't spend that much time, but it's becoming more and more common. It's just an interesting moment where it's like anytime I'm spending time around kids, usually the parent is there, besides Ollie would be the exception to that, right? But like that moment, the way he's like, it's 2 a.m. and tomorrow we're going to Dinosaur World, and Clifford's not being more or less, for lack of a better term, obedient. And listen, I don't know why I'm invoking myself, because I'm not ever in positions where I'm having to like boss around other people's kids, but there's, whether you're at the park with your friend and their kid or something like that, and, you know, or whatever, and you're like, oh shit, how do I even just for this person's safety, like tell them, no, don't run into the road or whatever. And I think as a non-parent, but as a good person, it's particular. I just related to it, and there's so much conveyed in his face. Did I land that point at all? I don't think I did.
No, I know what you mean. He's in a very difficult position. I think here's what I'm thinking, Zach. I think we should cut to our interview and hear what our guest thought about the movie. And then I'd like to hear your kind of thesis that you referenced. I want to tell you about kind of an aspect to this movie that I thought was quite well articulated that I hadn't really thought about any other time I watched it. And then, so let's cut to our interview, and then we'll talk a little more about that. I'm very excited about our guest today. Now, we have had a few guests that people are like, how do you get these guests? I'm talking about guests like your wife, my girlfriend, our cousin, right? These are all actual guests that we've had. And people don't even notice sometimes that we share a last name with a guest, or that we have this familial or close connection with the guests in the outside world. All they notice is that we have great guests, right? But we're very lucky because we're getting a pull from an amazing pool when we just look at our friends and family. There's so many just interesting people there. And this is a guest who I have wanted to have on the show for a while, and I think you have too. Now, listeners may notice this guest also has the last name Glenn, just like you and I do. And I know that we talked about with each other that we thought he would be particularly well suited to discuss the movie that we've been talking about today, because in that movie, Clifford, Martin Short is playing a 10-year-old boy. Now, you and I were both 10-year-old boys at one time.
Yes.
Right? Not at the same time. Probably important to note.
Not at the same time.
I was
How long
a 10-year-old.
was I 10 for? About a year and a half? No, a year. Yeah. Okay.
Well, no, be honest. You were 10 for 13 months.
Yeah, that's right.
You had one extra month of being 10 because you're special. No, but you were a 10-year-old boy when I was a 13-year-old boy, a man according to the Jewish tradition. But our family we grew up Christian, so I was still a boy at that time.
Yes.
And I was a 10-year-old boy when you were a 7-year-old boy. But we've both done it. However, instead of going all the way back into the recent, I'd have to remember, for me to remember when I was 10, I'd have to go back, 15 years in my memory.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
and we have established we are 3 years apart. So you would have to go back 12 years to remember when you were a 10-year-old boy. And sure, we can probably do that. We can probably dredge some things up. But when discussing a movie where a man is playing a 10-year-old boy, who better to talk about that with than a 10-year-old boy himself? And so I want to welcome to the show my son, your nephew, Oliver Ashglen.
Yellow, is this thing on? Hello? Can everyone hear me? Okay, everyone can hear me? Great. Okay.
Welcome to Idiot Talk, Ollie.
Hello, Father.
Hello. Now, let me ask you this. One thing we didn't discuss off mic. I seldom call you Oliver. I usually call you Ollie. Is it okay for me to call you Ollie on pod?
Why, yes, it is, Father.
Okay, great. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. I just pranked TOZ. Wow.
It was a good one, too.
You guys weren't listening. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't get that. Why don't you can tell what the prank is since we didn't get that on mic.
Well, the prank is like this, it's like a ketchup bottle with but instead when you squeeze it, instead of ketchup, like a red rope comes out.
Yes.
It's very fake looking, so you kind of have to do it quick so they don't realize what's happening.
It's all about sleight of hand.
Yeah.
And TOZ, and by the way, we keep referring to TOZ. That is what you call my co-host, Zach. T-O, Spanish for uncle, Z, the first initial of Zach.
Yeah.
Now, I'm glad we got you early kind of in your podcast career, because this is, if I'm not mistaken, your first podcast appearance. Am I correct about that?
Yes, but not my first far from my first appearance on an electrical device.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Okay.
And you got really good mic technique there, though. Is this the first time you've spoken to a hot mic?
Yes, I mean sometimes at my mom she owns a bookstore, and there sometimes there are author readings. Sometimes I test out the mics, but other than that, no. Yeah,
Oh, that's really cool.
thank you.
Now, I did establish you are a 10-year-old boy. Is this true?
Yes,
Okay. And you watched Clifford.
the big red dog.
No, well, we did. A lot of that came up when we were looking for it.
I did watch that though when I was like maybe watching PBS.
Hey,
Kids.
me too, buddy. My mom, or Walker and I's mom, Lita, as she's known to you, we would read. I don't know that we owned a ton of Clifford the Big Red Dog, but I is familiar as a story character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
But that's not what we're talking about, though.
That is not what we're talking
Oh,
about. But I would
right.
say, as a question that was not on our list of questions that we have for you today, if you've now seen Clifford starring Martin Short, and you've seen Clifford the Big Red Dog on PBS Kids when you were a
Yes.
little younger.
yes.
What would you say, just right off the bat, what's the superior Clifford?
Oh, obviously, Martin Short, Clifford.
Okay.
As far as strength, like Clifford could literally just step on Martin Short and like he would be gone. But
Sure.
in like an actual like movie and show and like stuff like that, I would much rather have a Clifford show than a Clifford the Big Red Dog show.
That makes sense. We watched this movie together for your first time. I've seen it many times, but it had been quite a while. But it was a different experience watching it with a kid. Now, we watch a lot of movies together, and you generally have pretty specific reasons that you liked or did not like them. I wanted to know, what did you think about this movie in general? Were you a fan of it? Why don't you talk about it?
Well, Walker, because that is the name that I call you in this household. Usually,
Now I'm going to just interject right there and say I don't want our listeners to think that I have one of these kids that calls me by my first name, but in my capacity as host of Idio Talk, I will allow it this time.
no, it was just a joke. But I was a fan of this movie because it was funny.
Okay.
Mhm.
And also, in my opinion, though, I feel like that, like, Daddy has before said that possibly now kids age, like, faster now. But, like, I feel like that Martin Short's impression sounds a bit more like a 6 or 7-year-old, at least in my opinion. Because when I say something like, that's great, I don't say, that's the bestest thing in the whole wide world, you know?
Yeah, I know what you mean. That's a good point. He does ham it up and talk like maybe it was from like an older era, which sometimes can sound like a younger kid. Maybe. I see what you mean, though. Even though Clifford's very smart,
Yes.
for a 10-year-old, the character, he does talk a little bit younger. But sorry, you were continuing with your thoughts on the movie. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just general thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that, like, I'm also a bit confused by, like, how come, like, there's, like, a huge, like, Larry the Scary Rex, his ride literally comes with a laser where you shoot him, and then in the future, it's just, like, bushes, basketball, gymnasium.
Oh, so you felt like the tech got less in the future?
They should have made like flying cars in the background, giant cities. Where was all of that? It was just like
a very
trees.
interesting observation. I think that they went through for a more of a minimalist approach, like they didn't go with the flying cars as much. But if you notice at the boys' school, like to get into the gate, the keypad looks kind of futuristic. But I think that's a good observation. I hadn't thought of that, Ollie. Oh, and remember also when he's talking to the boy, he says, and then one day, out of the blue, which was an expression we used to use back then. So there's only little clues that it's the future. But you're right.
Oh,
I think the biggest one is in his voiceover narration, he refers to at what was that time known as the city of Los Angeles. So I'm like, that's and what are the implications of that? Is it like the grim implications of that the big earthquake has happened and the city of Los Angeles is no longer a city, or it's the Los Angeles exists still, but has been named something else, or
Well,
what
Escape
could
from
that
LA
mean?
didn't come out until 1996, so maybe they were ahead of the curve.
That is true.
Okay, so it sounds like I remember after we finished it, you said I had one criticism, and I put my finger up and I tapped the sign that said "Save it for the pod," and
Because that's totally in our house.
yeah, I mean it should be at this point, right? Now I'm not just podcasting with my brother, but my son as well. Soon I will have no conversations with any family members that are not on a podcast. That's the goal eventually. But I'm guessing that those were maybe the criticisms that you were holding.
Yes.
Okay.
Actually.
So in general, what else did you like or not like about the movie?
I really liked all of his faces, which I feel like is a bit of a go-to. It's just like they're all very funny. I like the ending. Like they put everything together really well. Like not in like too zany of a way though.
Yeah.
Which I liked. Also at the same time, this kid is like very extreme. Like because like if we were, let's say me and Daddy and we were flying over Disney World, which quote unquote dinosaur world in Clifford's universe. If I heard that if I could water land the plane, I could go to Disney World, I would definitely not do that. This kid literally risks like hundreds of lives.
Well,
just
actually, Ollie,
to go to Dinosaur World.
That I think you're keying in on exactly what I wanted to ask you next. So I agree with you. He is extreme, but just in as general or specific as you want to go, did you find Martin Short's portrayal of a 10-year-old to be fair or to be? You kind of already answered it already. You said some of the like bestest, the way he would say that like sounded maybe like a little bit younger, but setting aside the fact that it's clearly a grown man, did you buy him as a 10-year-old?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Like again, I've already said the reasons. No, like bestest thing in the whole wide world. But on the other hand, like he like just like acts like a kid also at the same time.
Yeah. What about like how much he loves sugar? That really stood out to me this watch that I don't know that I ever caught as much before. Or yeah, just little things
I'm also
like that.
surprised that like practically no, like sometimes people will acknowledge it, but like it's not like anyone's like, put that away. Why are you eating so much sugar? No wonder you're so hyphy. They're
well, because
like,
he's with like
he's eating cake.
He's with people that are basically strangers in a way, right? His Uncle Martin and Miss Sarah Davis. They're not strangers, they're family, but Uncle Martin hasn't spent any time. And so sometimes, not with you or I, because we know each other, right? So like when you,
yeah, we do.
Like when you and your dad came up a couple weeks back, you asked me, do we get to do the ice cream and crushed Butterfinger thing, right? And I could either say yes or no. But with Clifford, he's kind of taking advantage of the fact that they have to be nice to him in a way, right? Because they don't have that established history.
Oh yeah.
He's what they call opportunistic. He's bad. He could be a bad boy sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm curious, Ollie. Speaking of Clifford's relationship to Uncle Martin, I found it very interesting watching this with you that it does not center around Clifford's relationship with his parents. They exit the film pretty early. This is about Clifford's relationship with his uncle. Now, you have an uncle, and
yes,
listeners may know your uncle as the co-host of the podcast Idio Talk.
Yes.
That they're listening to right now and that you're appearing on right now. I wanted to know, how did you...
Wait, I'm on Idio Talk?
Oh, yeah.
Wait. Am I being recorded right now?
Yes.
I'm going to leave this. I don't want this much attention.
Listeners, Ollie has taken off his headphones and exaggerated. He has stormed out of the room, committing to the bit.
Wow, he's really committed to the bit.
So, Ollie, what I was curious about is, how did the relationship between Clifford and his Uncle Martin remind you of your relationship with Zach, your uncle, TOZ, as you call him. Did you find it similar in any ways? Was it very different?
It was.
And why or why not?
It was probably the opposite because, like, not to speak for TOZ, but I think that we're both, like, pretty chill with each other at all times. Meanwhile, in the end of, like, Clifford, his uncle is basically trying to kill him. So.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say quite different.
And even
Thankfully.
before that's okay. That's a good answer. And even before it gets to the most extreme stuff, did anything you've been watched by just TOZ a few times, right? Did any of that feel similar to how Uncle Martin and him interact?
I mean, TOZ, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm that annoying, to be honest.
No. Let me jump in, and I want to hear more from you, Ollie, because you're a good boy, and Clifford is a bad boy. Let's just simplify it, right? But
as in the quote, bad boy Clifford, bad
exactly, boy. Bad boy Clifford. And now I've never said to you, bad boy Oliver, thankfully. And yes, and I never will. But even though Clifford's a bad boy, what it reminded me of is Uncle Martin. You're right. He is he's putting Clifford in a bad position, in a risky situation because he's mad at him at the end. But he is a pretty good guy considering how bad Clifford is, and in that way of just being a good guy. But I don't have any kids, and Uncle Martin didn't have any kids. I did see myself a little bit in Uncle Martin, just in that he's just trying to be a fun uncle. And that's where the similarities end, because like we said, you're a good kid and Clifford's not. But that was all I saw.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. So I know you love movies about a kid or a teenager getting to do whatever they want. Would you say that's accurate? Yes or no?
I can understand the feeling of sometimes wanting to do something else. But I've seen enough movies like Home Alone that just eating junk food and watching TV day and night would get very tiring very fast. So, I would do, a few fun things if I realized that I was going to be alone for a while, probably. But at the same time, I probably, wouldn't go, super crazy. Let's eat only sugar for a week.
Well, I like your example of Home Alone, though, because that's about a kid, right, being alone and kind of he has to. But what about the movie Big? So I know I didn't watch the whole thing with you, but your dad told me that when you saw Big, you said, to paraphrase, that you agreed with a lot of the actions and decisions that the character made when he was in the adult body. So did you agree with any of Clifford's actions? And there's no right answer, yes or no. But was there ever a point when you're like, I could see why Clifford would do that? I know he's... Go ahead.
I feel like that Clifford, did it... In my mind, Clifford's conscience wasn't born until, the older Clifford says, until that very moment, after his uncle saves him.
I agree.
I feel like that basically didn't have a conscience because, sure, I can see, being a little irritated when I'm like, dang it, I'm right above Disney World. But at that moment, I wouldn't be like, Mr. Airplane Man, could I go crash your plane? And they would be like, no. And I would be like, well, I'm gonna do it.
Sure. You know? Yeah. He's an exaggerated version of what sometimes we would want to do, but he takes it so far. Go ahead, Walker. I'm sorry.
Well, I think that's a great answer. Were there any moments, even though you disagreed with maybe Clifford's methods, were there moments where you found yourself on his side?
He does horrible things. He should be punished.
Okay. Gotcha. Fair enough. Fair enough. Real black and white take on it. I love that.
No, he's pretty. I mean, I love what you said so much, Oliver. I think about the moment his conscience is born. And that struck me watching it this time too, when he said, for the first time, I don't know the exact line, but he said, for the first time in my life, I felt truly awful. And his words had devastated me. And you're right. And it's the first time we see that expression of sadness and conscience, like you said. So I saved me from having to say that later. Yay. Bested by a 10-year-old yet again.
Yay.
What did you think the funniest part of the movie was?
Well, what was the part that made me laugh the most? You asked me this question after movies, and I always
This
forget.
movie is hard to remember the funniest part because, like you said, Ollie, his expressions are what is so funny. I think that there are laugh out loud moments, and maybe you'll remember it, but it is a lot of those smaller things that he does that I think are funny. But go ahead. I don't know. Maybe you did have a
I remember you laughing really hard when he would make his like evil face.
Yeah.
Like when you'd see him like hatching a plot and he like does that weird kind of like his eyes glaze over and he kind of like glares and smiles.
Yeah.
Anything else that you want to say about this movie before we let you go, or anything?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Goodbye.
Okay. Thanks for coming on the show.
Wait, you were listening to that? How dare you? Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, Ollie.
All right. That's the first time we've had a guest storm out on Idio Talk. Let's take a break and then we'll come back with some of our final thoughts about this movie.
Okay, sounds great.
Well, that was nice getting a 10-year-old perspective on this movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to hear a 34-year-old perspective from my brother Zach. What's the thesis you referred to that you have? And
I mean,
will you be taking this to grad school?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's like Marxist. It's like Marxist economics as displayed by 1994's Clifford.
You got there before I could. I was going to say, people will do like, will become like Citizen Kane or Casablanca experts or whatever.
Right.
It's like historians.
It's a Marxist analysis of the internalized racism of the American Indian as displayed by 1994's Clifford.
Of which I didn't spot a single American Indian.
No, I did not either.
But no, my overall, it's not really, it is related to Clifford. It occurred to me as I was watching it or more ruminating on it. And then after ruminating on my recent rewatch of Happy Gilmore, which I'm not saying is the funniest film ever, but I think as it relates to comedy movies, broadly speaking, my thesis is that I think the 80s and the 90s, the reason why those movies have such a long-lasting impact and influence in like daily vernacular. I mentioned the line "big gulps," from Dumb and Dumber earlier. Is one of the reasons for that is because they were so much less focused on referencing contemporary events and needing to be grounded in realism. And I'll give you an example of like a compare and contrast. The Hangover. I don't think The Hangover is that funny. I don't think it's that bad. I think, I would say that is a movie probably by people around my age or younger probably do frequently quote. And the big asterisk to all this is that I'm sure more contemporary comedies are quoted with just as much frequency. So I realize I'm really coming at this from when I was born, et cetera, et cetera. But
we don't. There is no monoculture now, though. You and I grew up in the monoculture, and that it's not like that anymore. There are things that break through that everyone may be obsessed with at the same time, but there are less and less of those things now. It's completely atomized. Ollie's favorite stuff is all on YouTube. And I've seen him ask his friends, "Have you seen Dumb and Dumber?" And none of them know what that is.
Sure. Yeah. But that's very well. Yeah. But my general thesis is that I think because comedies were less concerned with being relevant to the culture that existed at the time they were made. Happy Gilmore, there's a moment where he's like doing the Subway commercials and stuff, but that's pretty much it. Outside of that, it's just like it exists in the time. It's a story that you can relate to.
Sure.
And I think that makes it more quotable because it's like, how are you going to quote the Hangover movie? Are you going to quote when like any of the insane events that it's just, I think because comedy and they're so concerned with being winking at the audience of what's going on in the actor's life or what other events are happening in real society. I tried watching some of that stupid Flash movie, and there's a point where Ezra Miller's character says to a passerby, about the Justice League, yeah, our mental health is not great. And I'm like, was that meant to be played for laughs because Ezra Miller has all these horrible accusations that signal really bad mental health, or was it coincidence? I don't know. Marvel has really, really made that style persist of, Robert Downey Jr.'s character says, yeah, and he left a Banksy at the crime scene. How's that joke going to age? How's that going to be funny? And I don't know, but like I quote Happy Gilmore, I quote it to Walker through text, jackass, or, it's a silly joke. Or like and we talked about Clifford is not widely known, but when we were growing up, Clifford says in the movie, Clifford says to his mom, whatever you say, sweet one who birthed me. Walker would jokingly echo that line, or I believe there is a difference. So my thesis is that I think it was great to watch comedy movies in particular in a time that were focused on being that and not being these cultural reference points to what exists around them. Thus concludes my thesis.
I agree with that. I mean, I do think that comedy is way less character driven now because like look at SNL, right? And like how many modern SNL sketches are about anything other than what happened, not just in the news that week, but on Twitter that week. They're like playing out like whatever kind of happened on the internet that week. When's the last time you saw like a character on SNL, like Debbie Downer or something?
Or Massive Head Wound Harry.
Yeah, just something ridiculous that is not super married to the time it's in. It's like somebody
Wayne
playing
and Garth,
a weird guy.
Right.
And they don't really do that anymore. So I agree with you. I think that's a good observation. I think this movie, in some ways, no, actually, I was gonna say, is this movie very 90s? I don't really think it is, except for in the ways where it like tries to be a kid's comedy a couple times when it doesn't have to be. Because the thing is like kids are savvy about comedy, and you don't need to like condescend to them with like pratfalls necessarily and stuff. Like we saw this as kids and understood what was inherently comedic.
We were imitating the subtleties immediately as 10-year-olds, or you were at least.
I really like and agree with your observation. Would you like to know my observation about this movie?
I'm dying. I would love to, please.
So I'm not going to pretend that this movie is more serious than it is or deeper than it is, but it does have an intelligence about a specific aspect of childhood because in some ways, Martin Short's performance is a very like not literal 10-year-old in certain ways. Although he does have a set of verbal and physical mannerisms accompanying it that like do put you in mind of a little the fidgeting. He like fidgets like a kid, and our guest referenced some things that they I think took a little bit of offense at, that his speech is maybe younger than a 10-year-old in our guest's mind. I don't know
he
if
gets
I agree
agitated
with that.
a little bit like a child, and the wait scene.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the wait scene is a perfect example of what I was going to talk about. This was I think this is the first time I have ever watched this movie as a parent. And I think that I would have expected it to make me have less empathy for Clifford and more for the adults. But I actually had more empathy for Clifford watching it now as a parent than I did watching it as a kid, because what this script and Martin Short's performance taps into really smartly is the total lack of autonomy that children have.
Yeah.
And do I agree with Clifford's reaction to that? No. But that is what Clifford is reacting to, is he is too smart for his age and
he's
body.
He's meant to be a above average intelligence 10-year-old. The illusion and all that aside,
he has to be.
Yes.
Yeah, the way he's
cunning.
Talking and the things he's doing. Yes, cunning. Exactly.
Yes.
He's played 4-dimensional chess through the whole movie, and very manipulative and plotting and all those things. So Clifford is internally like experiencing the dissonance of how smart he is versus how he is at the whims of all these adults who we see his parents like, absolutely empathize with, why they are. Is there no end to your madness? I certainly can understand why they are at their wits' end. Clifford is incredibly annoying. But it's not like they don't seem like good parents to me. It very efficiently makes it seem like the dad is a totally absent workaholic and the mom is like a drunk.
Yes.
And Uncle Martin starts out with, I think, good intentions, but he has no idea how to treat this kid either. Mm-hmm. He's completely wrapped up in his own shit. It's like all the adults, I guess the word I would say is all the adults we meet around Clifford, with the exception of Sarah Davis, maybe, who is very in touch with how children feel. And probably,
but she is a little repulsed by him, which I never caught either.
I think you're right. And I think she doesn't know what she's feeling. Like she's
right.
There's some internal voice telling her there's something not right about Clifford that she can't quite put her finger on.
Which I love though, because there's some really great face acting, obviously by Martin Short, but between Mary Steenburgen and Charles Grodin, and not even between them necessarily, when she meets Clifford, not based on the fact that it's a 35-year-old man playing a 10-year-old, because the character of Clifford is off-putting. It's a micro expression, but she's like, hang on a second. I put a lot of pressure on Uncle Martin, or on Martin, that he needs to be ready to have a family if we're getting married. I'm meeting this child and I'm kind of
he's brought home this fucked up kid.
Yes. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, there's any way you could read a scene, but and there's multiple moments now as Clifford twists events to make it seem like he's being abused by Uncle Martin, she puts that aside, because regardless how shitty a kid is, if you see a child being harmed, you're going to step up. So that kind of goes away, but there are several moments where she's like, ugh.
But listeners, you also heard Zach right. Like, that is also a plot point in this movie rated PG and marketed at families, is that Clifford is implying and and like fucking Gone Girl or something. He's like fabricating crime scenes to make it look like Uncle Martin has hog-tied him in his room. Like, this is a really messed up movie.
We talked about, though, that the bad boy Clifford, it's his first moment of trying to proto-parent. And I think I said I relate to that. I don't. I relate to the idea of being puzzled if you were saddled with a kid, right? But there's a scene that matches it after Clifford has made it seem like Martin has called it a bomb threat, and they're back at his house, and things are much worse this time. There's all gone are the pretenses of bad boy, you're my nephew. It starts off with, I am now out on bail. I have a criminal record. And anyways, the scene goes on, but there's a moment where he goes, here's what we're going to do. You're going to write a confession, and you're going to tell Miss Sarah Davis that we are the best of friends. And Clifford says, and we are, aren't we? And he goes, shut up. I just love it.
He doesn't even look at him when he says, and we are, aren't we? Shut up.
Like an adversary, like an adult adversary. Sorry, go ahead. I feel like I interrupted your point.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, just all these different parts are coming up. All I was saying is, you brought up the scene where he's saying, wait. And so there's one key scene that taps into this kind of just feeling of powerlessness that you have as a child, and that it watching it now, I think, because I'm able to more easily empathize with my young self through my kid than I am by remembering my own life, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally.
It's easier for me to kind of look at him and get a sense of what he's feeling and go, oh yeah, I remember feeling that way, than it is for me to be back in my own body. Mm-hmm. And there's the scene where afterwards, after Clifford has been told, it's before he basically unleashes his torrent of torture on Uncle Martin, when he doesn't know what to do, but has been told, you're not going to Dinosaur World. Mm-hmm. And he's in the room. It's one of the only times we see him by himself. No, that's not true. It's a time that we see him just by himself. Martin Short is alone in the room talking to his toy dinosaur, Stefan, who we haven't even mentioned.
Walker, this scene broke my heart.
And he's crying, and he's just going, this is so unfair.
It isn't fair, Stefan.
Yeah, and he goes, he's the one who broke his promise and I'm the one who's being punished. It isn't fair. It's never fair. And I was like, oh my God, I remember that sense of injustice of like, no one gets my side of things that every kid goes through. And then the other thing in this movie, you brought up the wait scene. So there's a part where a woman at a dinner party.
Describe it a little bit.
This woman sees Clifford and goes, oh my God, he's so adorable. She grabs him by the face and starts kissing him on every cheek. And he's going, wait. And then he goes, wait. And he screams. And it's like this, you can hear a pin drop moment. Yeah. But that and the hair ruffling, Zach. I was keen on how many people ruffle Clifford's hair. And
which he despises.
And we'll talk about
Anyone despises that, though.
Right. And it reminded me of one way that things I think have really come a long way is the sense of bodily autonomy that we try to give kids now. Because, and this is a really dark thing to say on a podcast where we're joking around a lot, but it's like, we teach kids about like strangers and how to say no and not put themselves in dangerous situations with adults. But then also, well, I don't think we teach them this now, but I think like as recently as our generation, it's like an adult's demands of your personhood trump any sense of autonomy that you have. So it's like if somebody says, can I have a hug? You give them a hug. If somebody like ruffles your hair, you let them ruffle your hair. It's like the I don't like that, please don't do that is like was not really I don't think emphasized in how we taught kids to communicate. And now I think there's a lot bigger emphasis on, in a culture that is like really putting in schools and things like that. It's like, consent is like a huge part of like how they teach sex education. And that's teaching kids at a very young age how to like identify their own sense of, no, I don't want you to touch me or whatever.
Unless parents are spanking nowadays, hopefully, it's at least talked about more that like spanking. So, I know a lot of folks out there, I'm not saying my position on it, but it is a confusing message to tell a child, these are your private parts, but I can hit them when you've been the worst. So I think it just goes along with what you're saying. The messaging is different now, but I think to what you're saying though, this is why I relate to Uncle Martin a little bit is that because yes to everything you said, but because I have friends with kids and I'm not put in positions to ever even need to be remotely disciplinary, nor would I. But if it is something where I'm just kind of like, I don't have kids. And even if I did, I am so uncomfortable with the idea of needing to be the adult at all. Right. But I am very like safety conscious and you know what I'm saying? So it's like, and I think that just comes with time. And if you have kids, you get more comfortable and stuff. And I'm not uncomfortable around him, but I think Uncle Martin is aloof. He's aloof, but he wants to do the right thing. And he wants to do the right thing in 1990 as a 55-year-old dude. I sometimes feel aloof in 2023, as somebody who really wants to respect people's parenting style. But, I don't know. That's all.
No, yeah. I mean, I think that's a completely fair characterization. But the first time we see Clifford get his hair ruffled, Uncle Martin does it. And Clifford makes this face of like the way a dog puts its ears back when it doesn't like what you're doing. He squinches his face up really tightly and he kind of like blinks really hard and he goes, normally I would despise when somebody ruffled my hair like that, but not when you do it. And then we see it happen 2 or 3 other times throughout the movie that somebody else will see him. And I'm like, oh yeah. Not only did kids have to deal with like you're told where to go and what you can do and what you cannot do, and if the plans change because of shit going on in adults' lives, tough shit. Now I'm not saying that's wrong. That's like that's part of being a kid, but it is really an infuriating feeling as a kid that you have no control over your own destiny. And in the 1990s and any time before, you also just had to deal with every time an adult sees you, if they want to pinch you or ruffle your hair or pick you up or whatever. I'm like, they may not mean it with any sort of malice at all, but it's like kids are also taught to just go with however adults want to deal with you physically too. And so this time I really had a lot of empathy to what Clifford was lashing out against. And I think he kind of takes out his anger at the entire adult world on Uncle Martin. And that's not really fair. Like, Uncle Martin becomes the focal point. But I do think that, like, I was like, oh, the script does... It doesn't, like, this movie doesn't just hold Clifford up as an object of contempt. There is some, like, identifying with, like, what he's going through and why he thinks he needs to do these things.
Yes, and I think that's such a good point and such stellar analysis. And another example, and I still thought this part was very funny, and this goes to the line that Walker's quoted frequently in our first season. But when he essentially embarrasses Charles Grodin's character by telling Charles Grodin's boss, "That's the bestest looking wig I've ever seen." That is so something a kid would do, where they don't understand the context of it's not good to compliment somebody with, like, normally I hate potatoes, but not when you make them. That's not a good. It's kind of like Clifford's version of doing that, right? And
yes,
and I don't think that that's actually malicious. But to your point though about being trapped in the kid existence, what I also think it's speaking to is, like, how frustrating it is that, because when you're almost on par with adults in a lot of way in terms of your intellect, but due to your size, your age, whatever, you are subjugated so much so, and I think that it's also speaking to that, not to, like, other smart kids, but just that oftentimes we discount children's relevance or their ability to understand things. Like, it's a work thing. You wouldn't understand. We can't do what you want. Just shut up and deal with it.
You're trapped.
Like you said. Yeah. And we see that Clifford is trapped, but he's on par with the adults. He's outwitting Uncle Martin left and right.
That's right.
I don't know.
Zach, before we wrap it up, I kind of wanted to just, like, rapid fire. What are some of your favorite, like, quotes or, like,
Sure.
or parts of this movie? Just little snippets.
Okay, I'll give one. I really latched onto Charles Grodin this time. And through a chain of events that we won't go through, when he ends up running into his fiance in San Francisco, and he's ranting at her as to why Clifford is terrible. And in this part of the film, we hate Clifford too. And so she doesn't understand it though. She thinks he's terrible. And she goes, "Where's Clifford?" He goes, "Clifford's fine. You just give him a book about Hitler. He's probably happy." And she goes, "What? Clifford wouldn't blah, blah, blah." And he goes, "You don't know the first thing about Hitler, Clifford." That part made me laugh. And even though it's an uncomfortable scene, I do think the physical gag of Mary Steenburgen, she is a man attempts to assault her. It's not 100% played for laughs, but it's dated, as Walker said. But he was trying to woo her by giving her a really expensive gaudy necklace, and she rejects him and is getting mad. She's trying to take the necklace off, and it gets stuck on her face because she's lifting it up, and she goes, "What is this thing soldered on?" And I just thought that part was really, really, really funny.
She's a terrific comic actress. I
love
great
her.
timing, very funny. Okay,
go
from
ahead,
around the same part of the movie, I think this probably got the biggest laugh of the night from the adults. So Nicole and I watched this with Ollie. I think the hardest Ollie laughed was at different points where he would, like, play the piccolo or, like, just, like, stare off into evil space. Like, it was,
Right.
But the like line that probably made the adults laugh the hardest is there's a point where Uncle Martin he's in San Francisco chasing Sarah Davis, but he has been duped into going there by Clifford.
Right, yeah. He wasn't
and while
trying
he's
to spy on
gone,
her.
Clifford throws a giant, like, kegger at his house. And so there's all these, like, funny scenes where it's like this 10-year-old boy, like, partying with these teenagers and young adults.
Right.
And so then to, like, cover his tracks that he's thrown this giant party, when Uncle Martin comes back, Clifford has tied himself up in his room in his underwear and said that bikers broke into the house and had a party and tied him up. And the line is, I wrote it down, but I didn't have to because I haven't memorized. And
I know.
And he says that, he's telling him this story about the bikers. And he goes, "And they told me stories that they do on their bikes. Some of them were fun, but some of them were scary." Oh, let's see. Also, in the beginning, his mom at one point goes like basically kind of like exasperately screams at him like, Clifford, will you stop for 1 minute?
Clifford, will you please just stop it?
And he's rubbing his head on her body, like he's rubbing his head kind of on her arm, and he goes, whatever you say, sweet one who birthed me.
Mm-hmm.
I remember us saying that to Mama.
Yes. My other two favorite parts, I think, listeners, please go watch the movie. I don't imagine anyone still listening who hasn't seen it. But in the end of the film, Uncle Martin is given a choice. He loses his job, he gets fired, and everything. But he did design
all because of Clifford.
All because of Clifford. He did design Larry the Scary Rex in a theme park that is meant to be like Knott's Berry Farm or Disneyland adjacent. And he has a lifetime pass there. And he goes, after they closed. So this is my other favorite Charles Grodin line. It's when he goes, so he puts Clifford on the ride. He's totally lost his mind. And Clifford's just doing the ride. I actually really love the set piece of Dinosaur World too. I think it's incredible.
Agree. It's really good.
And that was something Roger Ebert hated about the film. And I was like, go fuck yourself. Wait till you see CGI in 20 years.
I think all the like film aspects of this movie, the set design and like the way
mix of miniatures during that
the
scene
music. Yeah. And there's like they use a map background too when they show Dinosaur World from like an aerial shot.
Love that. But anyway, so Uncle Martin has lost it. He goes, did you enjoy the ride, Clifford? And Clifford says yes. And he goes, let's see how you feel about it after 10 hours. And he goes, I think I need to go. He goes, let's see how you feel about it after 100 hours. And then eventually the ride breaks down from being overused. And this is my other favorite part. Clifford needs to be rescued. He's about, if he falls from this broken roller coaster, he will conceivably die or get seriously injured. And this is where Martin Short kills it again. He's so sympathetic. He goes, help, I'm scared. There are no three other words in the English language that make you see an animal that is conveying that or a child. And I feel it in that moment. And it's still a movie.
It's
but
the
Uncle
first
Martin
time he's like seemed innocent the whole movie.
And he has no plan either. He has no backup. There's no agenda. The way it's shot, it shows Uncle Martin standing in frame, and there's like mist. It's meant to be smoke from the broken roller coaster, but it's like a shot out of Goodfellas or something.
Yeah.
And his response after "Help, I'm scared" is he goes, "I'm thinking it over."
Yeah.
I just love that so much. That's all. That's all I got.
Okay, one more though. What about when? So there's a part where Martin like can convince, like kind of like every comedy. There's a like similarly to What About Bob. There's like a whole part of this movie where it's like
this movie.
Nobody.
Me a lot of What About Bob?
Me too. Nobody believes the sane person about how crazy or evil the bad person is, right? Yes. So like Sarah, everything that Clifford does just makes Uncle Martin look worse and Clifford look more innocent. And there's a part where he's raging to Sarah about all the things Clifford has done, and Clifford like just, bald-faced lied to Sarah, goes, what is he saying? Why is his face twisted so?
Wait, I love that so much. That was in high circulation. This is truly my last one. Also, Charles Grodin. After he rescues Clifford because he's a good man, he does the right thing. Clifford and Clifford is like he's playing it like a kid who is scared and just rescued. And he goes to hug him and he says, "I'm sorry." And he goes, "No." He goes, "I don't want to hug you. I what is it like? I don't want to hug you.
I can't imagine anybody ever wanting to hug you."
And he goes, "But I really am sorry." And he goes, "No, you're not, because sorrow is a human emotion."
And as we know, you're not a human boy.
You're just this destructive thing.
They do, they do make up in the end. And
Walker,
he gets to be the ring bearer.
I got to prompt. No. I got to prompt you. You got to tell about Look Like a Human Boy, and then we can go.
That one, listeners, you got to look it up. So look it up on YouTube. I watch
or
this
on our
scene
Instagram
once a month. There's a part where it's on YouTube. It's called like the only scene from Clifford you need. It is the funniest 5 minutes of improv I have ever seen in my life. And there is a part where he is telling Clifford, he's basically like, thinks he's regained control of the situation. And he's like, okay, here's what we're going to do to get out of this. But I'm watching you, basically. And he goes, if you do one thing that I find weird, if you even look at me, and then Clifford's giving him like the evil vacant face. And he goes, See, you're doing it right now. Can you look at me like a human boy? And Martin Short goes through this series of faces, each one of them more strange than the last, trying to look like a human boy. It is so funny.
It is so amazing.
Zach, I actually had one last thing which I identified as maybe the single darkest moment of the whole movie. Which is that it's after the like Clifford has like cried in his room about like it's not fair, and what he's decided to do is to take recordings that he has surreptitiously made of Uncle Martin to make it seem like he is called in a bomb threat and get him arrested as revenge. And it shows him making the tape, and Clifford looks to his toy dinosaur and goes, "Stefan, do you like Uncle Martin?" "So do I." And I was like, that is the darkest moment of this whole movie.
I think the darkest moments when he goes, "Sometimes I scare myself," because that, along with the face of when he's transforming to be evil Clifford, did feel like I'm not trying to overstate things, but it did feel like Martin Short maybe learned a little bit about like what serial killers do when they go into that. Not all serial killers. I realize it's a conscious choice to be murderous.
No, but he plays Clifford as psychotic.
Yes,
like psychotic, in the literal sense, I would say.
Yeah, great movie.
I loved it. I loved watching it. We'll be back discussing Fiona Apple next week. I hope you enjoyed this little side detour into movies. We're going to talk about a few more movies before the season's done, but we're going to talk about music, as is our bread and butter for the next few weeks. Zach, any last words?
I'm just so glad that we got a chance to do this. I hope it was enjoyable for the listeners, and I hope that if listeners, if you haven't seen it but you enjoyed watching it, watch the film with low expectations. It is a fun comedy to watch with maybe one other person, but please go watch this movie, and thank you for listening to our show.
Yeah, thank you very much, listeners. We'll see you next week on a Friday. I am Walker Glenn.
I'm Zach Glenn.
Bye.
Idiotalk is a Glenn Brothers production. Get in touch with us at idiotalk.podcast@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram at idiotalk.podcast. And thanks for listening to